evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry I'm speaking in English. I can't manage Spanish. The exhibition celebrates the treatment and cleaning of the Escorial Crucifixion by Rogier van der Weyden, one of the great masterpieces of European art, has been restored to its former glory. Parts, especially the lowest parts of this huge painting, are damaged, but the principal parts, all the heads and much of Christ's body, are well preserved. One of only 3 paintings by Rogier that are authenticated by documentary evidence, it can now be seen for the first time ever in company with the other 2, the Miraflores triptych at the bottom and the Descent from the Cross. No one, not even van der Weyden himself, has ever before seen the 3 paintings together, united in one gallery. The Miraflores triptych and the Descent from the Cross are exceptionally well preserved and must look now much as they did when they left Rogier's workshop. The crucifixion has been less fortunate, but now, thanks to the collaboration of specialists from the Patrimonio Nacional and the Prado, much of the painted surface has been returned to the state in which it must have been seen in 1464, the year of Rogier's death. The crucifixion was brought to the Escorial in 1567. In the inventory drawn up in 1574 of the objects given by Philip II to the monastery, the crucifixion was described as by the hand of Master Rogier, and it was noted that it had come from the Charterhouse of Brussels. That was the Charterhouse of Schut, on the outskirts of Brussels. In 1555, the Carthusians of Schut sold for £100, probably to Philip II, the image of the crucified Christ given by Master Rogier the painter. According to a manuscript copied in 1556 but incorporating transcripts of 15th century documents, Rogier's death was commemorated at Schut, and the Carthusians remembered what he had given to them, both in money and in pictures. I'll begin with a very short account of Schut, its miraculous image, the foundation of the Charterhouse, and the history of the buildings there. During the 1440s, a farmer bought a simple wooden image of the Virgin and fixed it into a tree that he had planted at Schut. One night, a great light illuminated the image and the place. Many pilgrims visited the site and left generous offerings. The Brussels authorities decided that a chapel should be built to shelter the image and at least part of the tree. The young Charles the Bold laid the foundation stone in February 1450, and building progressed at remarkable speed. Meanwhile, it was decided to establish a convent, that it should be a Carthusian monastery, and that Hendrik de Loon, then prior of the Charterhouse of Herne, quite near, should come to Schut as its first prior. The town of Brussels issued a charter of foundation in 1456, and finally in 1458 the Pope gave his approval, and the Chapter General permitted the formal incorporation of the monastery into the Carthusian order. Work began on monastic buildings, and the chapel, consecrated in 1455, was extended to provide a choir for the monks. It was separated from the public space where the pilgrims gathered to worship the statue. Eventually, a large wall was built to partition the building. Isabella of Portugal and her son Charles the Bold were among the first and most generous benefactors of the Charterhouse. Several courtiers, many of the most important people in Brussels, and some prominent people from outside Brussels made gifts to the chapel and the monks' choir of stained glass windows with images of saints, themselves as donors, and their coats of arms. Adjoining land was acquired by gift or by purchase. In 1469, the decision was taken to build a church, finished and consecrated only in 1531. It incorporated the chapel and the monks' choir, but I'm not sure exactly how the buildings were connected. After the iconoclast troubles and wars of the later 16th century, the Carthusians left and settled within the walls of Brussels. The buildings at Schut were destroyed or fell into ruin. The contents were looted or sold. Eventually, only the chapel remained. During the 19th century, it became part of a neo-Gothic church, but it was demolished in 1974. From the chapel, 4 corbels and 2 bosses were salvaged and taken to the museum at Anderlecht. The miraculous image is now in the church of St. Peter and Guy at Anderlecht. Here are an image of the miraculous Virgin from a late 15th century manuscript, a lithograph, top right, of 1823, showing the chapel as it then was, and lower right, an old postcard of the neo-Gothic church incorporating the chapel, here seen from the opposite direction from the image above. Next, the interior of the chapel from an old postcard. The miraculous image, that's the only image that I could find of the miraculous image, and I'm afraid it's very, very bad. And lower right, one of the salvaged corbels. Many people in Brussels took an intense interest in events at Schut. Rogier van der Weyden was, for several reasons, particularly interested. His eldest son, Cornelis, was a Carthusian at Herne and would have known very well there and at the University of Leuven Hendrik de Loon, the first prior of Schut. 2 of the first monks of Schut came from Herne. The architect of Schut, Gilles Joos, must have been a close friend of Rogier. Together they had endowed a chapel at Herne. Rogier would also have known and worked for many of the other benefactors of Schut. Rogier made a substantial loan to enable the Carthusians to buy some land. In return, they paid him fairly large sums in interest, soon converted into an annuity. His most spectacular gift, however, was the Crucifixion, a huge and arresting painting. At Herne, Rogier's donations were of a different kind. He gave a great deal of money and a picture placed in the chapel of St. Catherine, whose image he caused to be polychromed. That image had been one of the many gifts to Herne of his friend, the architect Gilles Joos, who gave to Schut an image of the angels, and that may, I'm guessing, have been a painting by Rogier. Rogier would have known that the austere Carthusians avoided expensive curiosities in painting and sculpture, but that in each of their monasteries they kept a crucifix in a solemn and eminent place. They also placed crucifixes above every altar. At the Charterhouse of Champmol, near Dijon, where the Dukes of Burgundy were buried, of course, each monk had in his cell a painting of the crucifixion. Rogier's crucifixion was sold in 1555 from the church of Schut. It is believed to have been an image mentioned in a description written in 1551. In the church, near the pulpit on the gospel or north side, is another image of the crucified Christ of wonderful size with the Virgin and St. John. It is closed with curtains of red cloth. Most writers believe that the image was Roger's picture and that it was kept behind closed curtains of red cloth. I wonder whether the author of the description, a monk of Skut, meant that the composition was closed with red curtains, and whether he was in fact describing the red hanging in the background of the painting. In that case, the Escorial picture was certainly the image near the pulpit. If not, we can't be certain. The pulpits were probably in the nave of the church, built between 1469 and 1531. The crucifixion would have been moved there from the chapel or the monk's choir, the only parts of the church that existed during Roger's lifetime. Roger may not have destined his crucifixion for a specific position. Indeed, he did not always pay attention to the positions in which his commissions were to be placed. In 1455, the abbot of Saint-Aubert at Cambrai ordered from him a triptych and specified that the centre panel should be 5 feet square. Roger, however, to improve the work and for no extra charge, decided on a panel 6.5 feet by 5 feet and delivered it in 1459. Evidently, it did not fit into its appointed place in the abbey church, and for 2 days the abbot had it displayed on trestles in different parts of the choir so that he could consider where it would look best. I imagine he was quite annoyed. Investigation of the panel of the Escorial Crucifixion reveals some important facts. This investigation was made here in the Prado by my colleague Maite Rogier. It's very large. Its width, 192 centimetres, is exactly 7 Brussels feet. The Brussels foot was 27.575 centimetres. Its height, 523.5 centimetres, is only slightly short of 12 Brussels feet. The wood is oak from the Baltic region. There are 13 boards laid horizontally so that the whole weight rests on the lowest board. It would have been safer to lay the boards vertically, but it may have been difficult, though it wasn't impossible, to find boards of Baltic oak, 323.5 centimetres long. In 1467 to 8, a few years after Roger's death, 14 boards, 325 centimetres long, were bought at Antwerp and made into the 2 panels on which Dirk Bouts was to paint his Justice of the Emperor Otto for the Town Hall of Leuven. They're now in the Brussels Museum, and the boards are laid vertically. It seems unlikely that Roger, who was wealthy, was saving money by using shorter boards. His panel, moreover, is not very well finished, and one board, the 8th from the top, in that sort of area, in the area of St. John's left hand, there, is of very poor quality compared with the other 12. It seems to me likely that Roger was in a hurry and that he could not wait longer until longer boards arrived from the Baltic forests, or until his Brussels joiners had planed to their usual standards the obverse and the reverse. The 13 oak boards come from 5 different trees, the latest heartwood rings of which were formed in 1427, 1442, 1442 again, and 1446. The last is the substandard board 8, which has very broad rings and 5 sapwood rings, the latest of which was formed in 1451. That tree must still have been growing in the Baltic region in 1455, which is the earliest possible felling date. Its wood cannot have been seasoned and exported for use in Western Europe until 1457 at the very earliest, and a more plausible date would be in the 1460s, shortly before Roger's death in 1464. I'm inclined to believe that Rogier was in a hurry. He may have thought that he was about to die. He wanted to paint an immense picture of the crucifixion in which he would bring to perfection various ideas on which he had been meditating for a very long time. Here are 3 images of van der Weyden. The first on the left is a copy in tapestry of the self-portrait that he included in his Scenes of Justice, to which I'll return very shortly. The second is an engraving published in 1572. The third is a painting that was the source for the engraving, or more probably a version of that painting. I believe that it is a posthumous portrait of Rogier based on a self-portrait, that the elderly lady may be his widow, and that the painter was possibly their son Peter, who took over the workshop when his father died. I've reversed the engraving so that you can compare the painting and the reversed image of the engraving. Rogier de Le Pasteur was born in about 1399 in Tournai, then one of the principal towns of France, but an enclave in the territories of the Dukes of Burgundy. He lived in Tournai and in Brussels, where his name was translated into Flemish as Rogier van der Weyden, and where he died on the 18th of June, 1464. His most famous works, enormous panels of Scenes of Justice in the Town Hall of Brussels, were destroyed in 1695 during the French bombardment of the city. The municipal archive perished at the same time, while the municipal archive of Tournai was lost during the Second World War. Brussels and Tournai, moreover, had been devastated during the iconoclast troubles of 1566 and afterwards. By then, fortunately for us, many of Rogier's most important works had been moved to Spain, to France, the great polyptych of the Last Judgment, painted for the Hôtel Dieu at Beaune, and still there, or to Germany. Brussels in 1421 and Tournai between 1423 and 1432 underwent periods of political and social upheaval. There was much violence, but the subsequent years of Rogier's life were far less turbulent, as far as we know. Brussels, its social, economic, and political problems to some extent resolved, was becoming an increasingly important and dominant centre of Burgundian power. Rogier seems to have maintained workshops in both Tournai and Brussels, but his principal residence was in Brussels, where by 1436 he was the official town painter. From around 1443, he was occupying 2 adjoining houses in the Golden Street, approximately equidistant from the Coudenberg Palace, the residence of the Duke of Burgundy, the Town Hall and the Markt, now the Grand Place, the centres of civic life and commerce, and the Collegiate Church of St. Gudula, now the Cathedral, the most important of all the churches. In 1453, a deed was signed in a dining room of Rogier's house. He therefore, it would seem, had more than one dining room, and it seems clear that he ran a busy workshop and that he may have had to feed a large team of assistants. One of his 2 houses may have been the place where he and his assistants worked, where his apprentices and perhaps other assistants lodged and where pictures were displayed for sale. He must have had studios big enough to accommodate huge panels like the Justice Scenes and the Crucifixion. Rogier was acquainted with at least 2 cardinals, Nicholas of Cusa, who saw the Justice Scenes in 1452 and called Rogier the greatest of painters, and Jean Jouffroy, who, writing in about 1468, mentioned my dearest friend Rogier of Brussels, whose paintings grace the courts of all the kings. Between 1441 and 1461, Jouffroy was councillor to Philip the Good and resided frequently in Brussels. Employed as a diplomat, he visited the courts of France, Italy, the Empire, Spain, Portugal, England, Bohemia, Hungary, and Poland. He was often in Rome. Pope Pius II, who knew Jouffroy well and made him a cardinal in 1461, disliked him quite a lot, but conceded that he had leafed through everything written in Latin. Jouffroy's library was an important collection of humanist texts, and he may well have discussed with Rogier the authors of antiquity. One of his most interesting manuscripts, the works of Homer in Greek with parallel Latin translations, was made in Rome in about 1461-2, during Rogier's lifetime. But there's actually no reason to believe that Jouffroy ever took it to Brussels, or indeed that he returned to the Low Countries between 1461 and the time of Rogier's death. But this was only one of the more spectacular manuscripts in his library. Here we have a posthumous portrait of Jouffroy from an early 16th century wall painting in the Cathedral of Albi. Next to it is a page from Jouffroy's Homer, the Latin translation in the left column and the Greek in the right column, and an illuminated page showing 4 scenes from the Iliad painted in Rome. And the last image, you'll see the Trojan horse, the wooden horse of Troy, if you look carefully. The best known of all Rogier's works were the scenes of justice, 4 very large panels painted during the 1430s and 1440s for the Golden Chamber of the Town Hall in Brussels. They were probably finished by 1452 and destroyed in 1695. Frequently mentioned and described by authors of the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, they are known from free versions in different media, and in particular from a tapestry in Bern, made for Giorgio of Saluzzo, Bishop of Lausanne, who died in 1461. It was woven during Rogier's lifetime, probably from cartoons made under his supervision. My description of the lost paintings is based on the writings of people who saw them and is illustrated with details from the Bern tapestry. The obverse of the tapestry has faded. The reverse, protected from light, is better preserved, and I'm showing slides of the obverse surrounded by details from the reverse to give you some idea of the extent of fading. Each of the 4 panels was divided into 2 sections. The subject of the first 2 panels was the Roman Emperor Trajan, who died in the year 117. The subject of the second 2 panels was Herkenbald, a possibly mythical figure from the remote past. The narratives were explained in long Latin inscriptions on the frames. These were reproduced, complete with decorated initials and line endings, in the Bern tapestry. Down here, there's a line ending. The principal figures in the tapestry are likely to be relatively faithful copies of their counterparts in the lost paintings. Trajan in gilded armour and on a white horse, the widow who accosts him, Trajan again in gilded armour, who is dismounted to try a soldier and supervise his beheading, the guilty soldier and his executioner. In the next part, you see Pope Gregory the Great at prayer, Pope Gregory examining Trajan's skull and discovering that his tongue has been miraculously preserved. The self-portrait of Rogier transferred from the second section of the third panel. So there you see the reverse, and he's here on the obverse. In the third panel, Herkenbald was seen rising in his deathbed to cut the throat of his nephew. His dying nephew, guilty of rape, the nephew's friend, a lady who is perhaps Herkenbald's sister, and then Herkenbald showing the host miraculously conveyed into his mouth, the astonished bishop who had refused Herkenbald the last rites because he said Herkenbald had murdered his nephew. No painting is known that is signed by Rogier. Indeed, he may never have signed his work. Only 3 pictures exist that can be considered on good and early documentary evidence to have been executed by him. And as I've said, all are in the present exhibition. The Descent from the Cross was painted before 1443 for a chapel in Leuven. An engraving dated 1565 credits the original to Master Rogier. The Miraflores triptych was given in 1445 to the Charterhouse of Miraflores near Burgos. The deed of gift, known from a later transcript, stated that it was by Rogel. Rogier, towards the time of his death in 1464, gave the crucifixion to the Charterhouse of Schut. These 3 pictures, very different in scale, have much in common. All are of religious subjects. All seem very lifelike. Rogier renders with astonishing fidelity details such as tears, blood, the threads from which textiles are woven and with which garments are shown. I show a detail of the cloth of gold robe worn by Joseph of Arimathea in the Descent from the Cross and draw your attention to the hook there. Oh dear, sorry, stupid. That's the hook, and that's the corresponding eye with which his collar would normally have been closed. Like his contemporary Jan van Eyck, who died in 1441, Rogier must have discovered early in his career that he could paint totally convincing representations of nature, but that he was not limited to imitating everyday reality. His feeling for shapes and lines was so highly developed that his compositions, based on geometric harmonies, were instantly striking and memorable. He had an inspired capacity for using colour and abstract shapes to heighten emotional response. He depicted credibly anything that he could imagine. He ignored, if he wished, logic of space and scale, and blurred distinctions between reality and sculpture. His constant allusions to sculpture and his interest in creating and denying artificially contrived or false architectural spaces should not come as a surprise, as he lived among and worked frequently with sculptors and architects. His paintings are so beautiful, ambiguous, and fascinating that they compel repeated examination. There is always something new to discover. In all the 3 paintings, the settings in which the figures are placed are completely implausible, for they have been exploited for emotive impact. The 3 pavilions, open on all 4 sides, in which take place the 3 events of the Miraflores triptych, have no obvious functions. In the left and right panels, which you see here, the more or less identical pavilions are constructed within more or less identical buildings of stone, again without obvious functions. One is enclosed and is the setting for a contemplative virgin. In the other, the doors are thrown open and the glass is removed from the windows. The side windows, which are glazed here, are unglazed here, to admit a joyous light in which the Virgin is assured of the miracle of the resurrection. The more closely Rogier's paintings are examined, the more enigmatic or ambiguous do they seem. They demand careful, prolonged, and repeated consideration. In the Miraflores triptych, for instance, the scenes in the framing arches are ordered so that the narratives move in an anti-clockwise direction, this direction, which is not the most expected. Rogier wanted, I think, his public to concentrate, just as he did in the inscriptions on the mantles worn by the Virgin in the 3 panels. All 3 are extracts from the Magnificat, which is Luke 1, 46 to 55. On the left wing here, verses 46 to 48 are embroidered in gold on the white mantle. And on the right wing here, where the mantle is blue, verses 46 to 48 are repeated and continued into verse 49. In the center panel, here, the inscription on the red mantle begins with the word Magnificat, but breaks off, continues into verse 51, and then breaks off again. Above the Virgin's face is written, Deus meus Deus. These are apparently the words spoken by Christ on the cross. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? The inscription on the center panel is written so that the bases of the letters follow the hem of the mantle. In the other 2 panels, the tops of the letters adjoin the hems. If Rogier had adhered to that system in the center panel, Deus meus Deus would have been upside down, and the words would have lost their immediacy. In the Descent from the Cross, the figures are reminiscent of polychrome statues carved from wood or stone. They inhabit a shallow, gilded box into which they cannot possibly fit. They generate feelings of claustrophobic unease. The spatial inconsistencies are made obvious by the fact that the rearmost figure, the servant behind the cross here, appears to have caught his right sleeve in the tracery at the corner of the box, and the bloody nails in his hand are actually overlapping the fictive frame of the picture. The cross itself, with its extremely short T-bar, could never have supported the body of Christ. The Virgin's legs have been vastly elongated to bring her feet back here to conceal the junction between the upright of the cross, the ladder, the box, and the vegetation in the base of the box. Christ is normally shown bearded. In Rogier's other depictions of Christ, he is always bearded. In the Descent, it seems that Christ was neatly shaved before being crucified and that his stubble has grown during his ordeal. Why? I don't know. I would welcome any ideas. As in the Miraflores triptych and the crucifixion, Christ's body bears no marks of the flagellation or the mocking that he has undergone. In the crucifixion, the figures are humans dressed in white, though they are displayed as if they are images. Christ's cross is placed against a wall and in front of a folded cloth of honor. At Golgotha, Christ died without ceremony. Here, as in the Descent, a strip of vegetation fills the lowest section of the picture and provides some support for the Virgin, the cross, and St. John. The background behind the red cloth is grey. It may suggest the darkness that preceded and followed the death of Christ. The grey must also represent a wall to which are attached the canopy and the cloth of honor. Carved crucifixes were and are displayed against such folded cloths and beneath such canopies. It seems unlikely that the life-size cross and Christ depict a huge carved crucifix. Christ's flesh and blood, his crown of thorns, and the nails are represented in their natural colours, as are the faces of the Virgin and St. John, St. John's hands and bare foot, and the Virgin's shoe. Their draperies are white, as is Christ's loincloth. yet it is semi-transparent, and through it can be observed the blood trickling from the wound in Christ's side. Christ, the Virgin, and St. John are humans, but they are at the same time statues, polychromed with exquisite skill and refinement. Here, Christ is dead. He said, "It is finished," and he bowed his head and gave up the ghost. After his death, one of the soldiers with a spear pierced his side, and forthwith came there out blood and water. The water is rendered beautifully in the Descent from the Cross, but it's not apparent here. Though Christ is dead, his head is bowed and his eyes are closed. He is weeping. One tear is falling from his right eye, 2 tears from his left. He is both an image and a human body. He is at once a corpse and a living, weeping man. The 3 tears may refer to the 3 occasions when Jesus wept. He wept tears of love when he heard of the death of Lazarus, tears of compassion when he foresaw the sad future of Jerusalem, and tears of pain when he prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane. The living, sorrowing Virgin and St. John do not weep. By making comparison with the 3 authenticated masterpieces and the Bern tapestry, it is possible to suggest further attributions to Roger. Only works of the very, very, very highest quality can be considered. The paintings include the Duración, Virgin and Child, the Crucifixion with Saints and Donors in Vienna. In the exhibition, there is a version of the main part of this composition from the later 15th century. The 7 sacraments in the exhibition, and the polyptych of the Last Judgment in the Hôtel Dieu Beaune, the closed polyptych on top and the open polyptych at the bottom. Various portraits may be related to the donor portraits of the Beaune polyptych, the most outstanding being the Philippe de Croÿ from the Antwerp Museum on the left, the Anthony of Burgundy, Grand Bâtard de Bourgogne in the Brussels Museum in the centre, and the portrait of a lady on the right in Washington. The portrait of Isabella of Portugal in the exhibition is similar and is probably a replica made in Roger's workshop. The presentation miniature of the Chronique de Hainaut is attributed to Roger and shows a manuscript being offered to Philip the Good, who is surrounded by his courtiers. The carved altarpiece in Laredo and the tapestry of the story of Jephthah were probably designed by Roger. Roger van der Weyden was a draftsman of supreme ability. The nude body of Christ in the Descent from the Cross, and particularly his feet and hands, are drawn with superb confidence and accuracy. Roger's mastery of foreshortening may be admired in the centre panel of the Miraflores triptych, where the Virgin, kneeling on her right knee, embraces and bends over the dead body of Christ, supported on her raised left knee. A very difficult pose, that one. The underdrawing of the Descent from the Cross, and there's a section of it, gives some idea of Roger's spontaneity and the ease and speed with which he could draw. In the Lost Scenes of Justice, Roger would have demonstrated his understanding of violent emotion and his capacity to depict the extremes of facial expression. Now they are best demonstrated and admired in figures of the Beaune Last Judgment. For example, a damned soul whose features are distorted by fear, or the terrified soul whose hair is standing on end with fright, who is looking down from St. Michael's scale pan into the fires of hell. An inspired draftsman, Rogier was a painter of astonishing skill who could work on any scale, always with immense accomplishment and often at great speed. He was willing to expend immense effort on details that would not normally be noticed or even visible. For example, Christ's tears in the Escorial Crucifixion, his hair and the blood flowing from the wounds conflicted by the crown of thorns. Rogier liked to paint wet in wet, to drag wet paint with dry brushes, to use impasto to suggest texture and to create real shadows that imply volume, and to layer one colour over another to affect the hue of the finished paint. The upper layer could also be scraped to expose the underlayer and to suggest texture or coloured reflected lights. When Rogier departed from reality, he always had his reasons. With his knowledge of mathematics and geometry and his interest in visual harmony, he constantly made slight adjustments to line and shapes in order to beautify them. He also made changes to heighten the expressive impact of certain passages. For example, in the Descent from the Cross, the jagged contour of the crown of thorns is stressed and echoed in the jagged shapes of the shadow in Nicodemus's sleeve, this jagged shadow all the way around here. As Rogier became increasingly successful, he appears to have taken on many assistants and to have developed strategies for managing teams of artists of varying abilities. Rogier would have reserved to himself and his most skillful and trusted collaborators the most important and difficult parts of his large paintings. He also produced simplified versions of some of his compositions where the poses were made more straightforward and the iconographical complexities were removed. In this way, he based on the center panel of the Miraflores triptych on the left a pattern for a Pietà composition which could be reproduced by competent assistants and which could be adapted to suit the requirements of different patrons. The Prado Pietà on the right is a particularly fine example of a workshop version, probably painted under Rogier's supervision by a highly talented assistant. 3 paintings of the crucifixion are known that are convincingly assigned to Rogier. The crucifixion with saints and unidentified donors in Vienna, probably painted in the 1440s. The 7 Sacraments, probably painted towards 1450 for Jean Chevreau, Bishop of Tournai, and the Escorial Crucifixion, painted during the early 1460s as a gift for the Charterhouse of Schut. There's also the right wing of the carved altarpiece in Laredo, probably designed in Rogier's workshop. All these images show Christ fixed with 3 nails to a T-shaped cross. His right foot is over his left. No wounds suffered during the flagellation are shown. In all, the wound in Christ's side is represented. As this was inflicted after his death and as he has bowed his head, the implication is that he is dead. There are also dramatic differences among the 4. In the Laredo altarpiece, the torment that Christ has undergone is very apparent as he hangs from the cross in the shape of a letter Y. His loincloth, borne up by a miraculous breeze, passes between the cross and his body, which arches towards us. The Virgin and St. John seem to make fluttering movements of desperate grief. In the Vienna crucifixion, in contrast, there is less agitation. Christ is crucified on a hillside outside Jerusalem. The small blue angels display anguish, but because their flesh, like their garments, is blue, they are removed from the realms of reality and empathy. A gentle wind keeps Christ's loincloth in place and makes St. John's mantle billow as he hastens to support the Virgin. She is seen from the back in 3/4 view and kneels in an uncomfortable though elegant pose. You can try it out at home. She turns her head to embrace and kiss the cross, where the blood dripping from Christ's feet makes a visual link with the tears on her face. Christ's head sinks forward, and his hairline continues the line of the T-bar of the cross. His mouth is open, and his teeth are just visible. In the seven sacraments, he is high in the nave of a church. His head and hands are close to the top of the clerestory. On our right, the bar of the cross disappears behind the ribs of the vault. There. His feet are level with the arcade arches. His head is perhaps 20 meters, 65 feet above the floor of the church. Christ is a gigantic figure on an immensely high cross. St. John, the Virgin, and the Marys appear to be on approximately the same scale, but the figures that populate the aisles and the chapels of the church are very much smaller, and the angels who preside over each sacrament are smaller still. All of them, however, are much too large for their chapels. Rogier's command of architectural space and his ability to control perceptions of relative scale are so developed that observers may not be immediately aware of the flagrant discrepancies in scale. Alone of all the figures, Christ has a halo. His mouth is open, his upper teeth are revealed, and his hair falls in front of and behind his right shoulder, while only a few hairs stray across the left side of his neck. Whereas in the Laredo and Vienna crucifixions, both Christ's knees point in the same direction as his head, in the seven sacraments, they turn in the other direction, towards our right, and put a twisting strain on his torso. The angels of the Vienna crucifixion, as in the Miraflores triptych, are all of one colour, so that their faces, hair, hands, robes, and wings are all blue, or in the centre panel of the Miraflores triptych, pinkish purple. In the sacraments, the seven angels wear differently coloured robes. Originally, their faces and hands were of the same colours as their robes, so the yellow angel had a yellow face and so on. During the course of painting, the convention was altered, and they were given flesh-coloured hands and faces. Fascinated by certain figures and certain compositions, Rogier seems to have meditated for many years on a crucifixion with only 3 figures before finally conceiving the Escorial painting. The crucified Christ repeats the Christ of the sacraments, but moves slightly downwards on the cross. His head is lower, well clear of Pilate's label. His nose, twisted more into profile than the rest of his face, remains at an angle of about 45 degrees, and his mouth is still open. Though his eyes have not been made visible, his eyelids have parted slightly so that the 3 tears might emerge. His long hair continues to cascade behind and in front of his right shoulder. Over his left shoulder, his hair becomes more entangled with the streams of blood from the crown of thorns. His legs remain turned to create a twisting strain. The upright of the cross continues to be seen from the left, but Christ's body is not really aligned with the cross, and that creates a certain tension. The loincloth remains fairly secure, though one end has loosened, perhaps to stress the connection between Christ and the Virgin, who is believed to have used one of her veils to make the loincloth. The Mourning Virgin repeats ideas first explored in the figures of Mary Cleophas and the Magdalene in the Descent from the Cross. Mary Cleophas, the Magdalene I've reversed for convenience in this slide. And the Magdalene on the left of the Vienna crucifixion. The Virgin's nose, like Christ's, is turned further into profile than the rest of her face, Her mouth is open, her left shoe appears between the highlighted crescent of drapery here that forms a rocking, unstable base for the whole figure. Her left hand would have been similar to the Vienna Magdalene's, but both her hands are concealed beneath a heavy fall of drapery, apparently the corner of the Virgin's mantle caught up from behind her feet. Like the Magdalene in the Descent, the Virgin may be collapsing or falling to her bended knees. The line of her contour expresses a graceful shudder. The fragility of the figure and the delicacy of her movements are strangely at variance with her statuesque appearance. The Virgin is considerably less tall than St. John, but takes a higher position on the hill and is closer to Christ, whose head sinks towards her. The St. John, too, developed from the Vienna Crucifixion, here reversed, and the Seven Sacraments, here reversed. And the hands have been altered. St. John's gesture of wonder may have been adapted from the Virgin's gesture in the Miraflores triptych, where she turns to witness the miracle of the resurrection. An idea of this composition existed, at least as a drawing, by the middle of the century, when the Virgin and St. John were adapted in the underdrawing of the center panel of the Redemption triptych, which you see here. Subsequently, in the finished painting, they were radically altered. Here is the underdrawing. It's difficult to see in the slide, but the Virgin's right eye rather, is actually underdrawn here. And if you sort of go out from there, this is illustrated in the exhibition catalogue. I hope that you'll be able to see the resemblance between this underdrawing and the figures in the Escorial picture. The idea for St. John became known to the painter of the crucifixion of the Parlement de Paris, a Parisian picture begun in or before 1449. This is the figure of St. John here, and there you have a comparison of the Escorial, and this is a very bad slide made by me. His St. John, however, in the Paris picture, is recognizably the same young man that was usually used for St. John in Rogier's paintings, the Vienna Crucifixion, the Miraflores triptych, the Descent from the Cross, and many more. He has fairly short, curly hair, a thin, slightly effeminate face and neck, narrow and slanting shoulders, and a slight body. The hands of the Paris St. John differ in pose, and his draperies differ in arrangement and colours from those of the St. John in the Escorial Crucifixion, who is a more stalwart youth with larger features, less tightly curled hair, a thicker neck, and more powerful shoulders. The impression of strength is emphasized by the long, unbroken lines of his robes. You can see that better in the whole picture, contrasting with the uninterrupted lines of the Virgin's draperies. St. John, here contrasted with the usual Rogier type from the Descent from the Cross, resembles to some degree Rogier's portrait of Anthony of Burgundy, the Grand Bâtard de Bourgogne, who was at that time establishing himself as a star of the tournament field. He had more or less taken over from the famous Jacques de Lalaing. The Paris St. John depends not on the Escorial St. John, but on an earlier and different figure. The figures of Christ, the Virgin, and St. John all reached ultimate perfection in the Escorial Crucifixion, where they were placed in an extraordinary setting and displayed as if they were living images dressed in immaculate white robes. The cloth of honour behind and the canopy above the figures were reserved for persons of the very highest importance. The Virgin in the left panel of the Miraflores triptych, Philip the Good in Rogier's frontispiece for the Chronique de Hainaut. In the crucifixion, canopy and cloth of honour form parts of the same textile. The orthogonals of the canopy disappear from the top corners of the panel, but green fringes decorate the edge of the canopy as well as the bottom edge of the cloth, while the vertical edges retain traces of gilded lines. They're painted in yellow paint. The folds ironed into such cloths of honour were decorative as well as functional, for they allowed the cloths to be packed neatly for storage. Here there are 5 vertical sections and 8 horizontal sections, the topmost section being concealed by the canopy. The ratio 5 to 8 suggests an interest in the golden section. The hanging and the canopy are off-centre, the cross is off-centre, but the wound in Christ's side is very, very close to the exact centre of the panel. The highest horizontal fold, where the cloth meets the canopy, is at the centre of the letters INRI and draws attention to the label. The next horizontal fold links Christ's elbows and his right eye. The third points to the wound in his side, the fourth, the loincloth, the fifth, almost tangent to the top of the Virgin's head, is through Christ's knees and John's right eye. The sixth fold links the Virgin's concealed hands with John's left hand. The seventh underlines Christ's feet and just cuts through his big toe on his left foot. The eighth is just above the Virgin's bending knees. The fringe at the bottom of the cloth is just above the base of the cross and makes an area of green that connects with the greenish hill of Golgotha. The first vertical links Christ's right arm with the Virgin's head. The next 2 vertical folds frame the upright of the cross and emphasize the label. The fourth links Christ's left arm with St. John. This composition is controlled with exceptional rigor, and every line of the grid has some relevance to the subject matter. This is a crucifixion reduced to its absolute essentials and in an improbable setting. A narrow and claustrophobic space against a blood-coloured cloth. It is cruel, Christ's twisted neck, his violently foreshortened upward grasping hands, the huge nails and the savagely wrinkled skin around the nail through his right foot, together with the wounds and the blood, are profoundly shocking. The savagery is perhaps all the more horrifying because of the mathematically controlled patterns of the grid and its interaction with the 3 figures plotted against it. The logic of its 2-dimensional design may be at variance with the irrationality of its presentation as an image of an image, but the conflicts intensify its almost hypnotic fascination. White was believed to indicate many things, but it was a colour of mourning. Widowed queens of France wore white, and Rogier could have heard of the sensation created in Paris in 1393 by the white funeral of the exiled king of Armenia. I won't go into this, but I find it quite interesting. We cannot know what Rogier intended the Carthusians of Scott to think about when, dressed in their white habits, they approached his picture. We can, however, be sure that it was meant to evoke many, many changing responses, and that all its ambiguities continue to enchant succeeding generations. It is accessible because, at one level, it is instantly understood and remembered, and immediately moving, but the observer is impelled to return again and again to contemplate its infinite complexities and to explore its many layers of meaning. We are caught between painting and sculpture, between simplicity and reality, and complexity rather, between the dead and the living, between the past and the present, between the symmetrical and the asymmetrical, between the quotidian and the impossible, between savagery and grandeur, and between the human and the divine. Working on this vast picture, Rogier may have been aware of his own impending death. He was certainly looking back on his earlier achievements, the scenes of justice, the descent from the cross, the seven sacraments, and he was, as always, attempting to perfect, as far as possible, the ideally beautiful figures of his imagination. In the exhibition, in the presence of his masterpieces, we can try to understand something of the aspirations of a man considered by his contemporaries the noblest and greatest of painters. Thank you.